From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan. David Feldman is once again playing hooky. Actually, he's not really playing hooky. He's observing Yom Kippur this week. We miss you, David. See you back next week. But we do have the man of the hour, a man who has never played hooky in his life, I don't believe. The hardest working man in any business, Mr. Ralph Nader. And we also have another interesting and thought-provoking show for you today, and we're going to get right to it because that's what we do in the show. We get right to things. We don't dilly-dally around. So on previous episodes, we've talked a lot about workers and workers' rights and unions and the labor movement and the minimum wage and the outsourcing of jobs. Today, we're going to talk about work from a slightly more philosophical angle. We're going to talk more about the nature of work. And our first guest is Matthew Crawford, and he's the author of Shop Class as Soulcraft, an inquiry into the value of work, which is published by the Penguin Press and is a discussion, as far as I know, of the value and integrity of being able to do something that I really don't know how to do, which is my wife does, but I don't. And that's the ability to build things and fix things. Matthew Crawford earned a PhD in political philosophy from the University of Chicago, specializing in ancient political thought, which you can also get by watching the Republican primary debate, too, I believe. And currently, Professor Crawford is a senior fellow at the University of Virginia's Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture, and he also practices what he preaches because he's a motorcycle mechanic in Richmond, Virginia. So Matthew Crawford, welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome, Matthew Crawford. I was really taken by your book, Shop Class as Soulcraft, an inquiry in the value of work, so much so that I bought copies for a roundtable up in Connecticut of electricians, plumbers, carpenters, people who work in the trades, which, of course, is the subject of your book. And they're really fascinated by it. It was a discussion that I wish was recorded because I'd like to see this go all over the country. They very rarely have a chance to reflect on their work, except when they are at work. They don't share the reflection with what we call knowledge workers, white-collar people who sit in front of computer screens. And I'd like to open the discussion by asking you to explain, what do you mean when you say the cognitive richness of manual work?
Well, simply that there's a lot of thinking going on when you're trying to, say, diagnose why some machine isn't working right, or you're trying to figure out how to get something perfectly plumb and square if you're building something. We often have this kind of dichotomy of knowledge work versus manual work, as though they're two very different things. But that distinction just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And if you've never attempted to build things or fix things, I can see how just the fact that the work is dirty might make you assume that it's also stupid. But if you've actually done it, that idea goes away pretty quickly.
Well, of course, intuitively, we all know that when someone can fix your toilet or repair your electrical system, and you don't know anything about it, that person has a thinking process that is quite precise, and you know at the end of the day whether it's going to work or not. Where did this cultural idea come from that parents want their children to go into white-collar work, desk work, watching screens, computer work, what you call knowledge work, and the information economy, when they really know that they don't really find that kind of work so gratifying? And increasingly now, there are more opportunities because white-collar work is increasingly being exported under the trade agreements. They are beginning to realize that better pay and there are more opportunities in millions of unfilled jobs in what you call the trades.
Yeah, I mean, at the sort of broadest level, I think what you said is true. Of course, you have to sort of look at particular trades, and some white-collar work is much, much better than others. I've had some of the lousier white-collar jobs, and that, I think, colors my view of these things. And as you say, a lot of it has become outsourceable. So, economists have started pointing out that the distinction that has emerged in the labor market in recent years is not the conventional one between those with more education versus those with less. Rather, it's between those whose service can be delivered over a wire versus those whose service has to be done in person or on site. And if you fit the latter description, that means your work is more secure from outsourcing. So you can't fix a leaking toilet over the internet. So therein lies a certain security for the plumber.
It's very much a distinction between reality and virtual reality, isn't it? And when kids grow up and they spend the bulk of the day watching screens, TV, their smartphone, computer, after a while, what does that do to their sense of empiricism, their sense of reality? There are books now written that they don't connect with nature. The sidewalks are empty. They don't play outside anymore. They're just fingering their entertainment device in their hand, starting at a very early age. What is this going to do in terms of connecting them with the reality, let's face it, of the political systems, electoral systems, the kind of industrial systems that remain humming away here with ever greater automation? What's it going to do to their minds?
Well, I think we're being trained into a kind of passivity and dependence, partly just by the fact that so many of the devices that we rely on or that entertain us are kind of opaque and don't really invite tinkering. They don't invite being taken apart. So this has, in other words, technology, I think, can have a pedagogical effect. It can form a certain kind of character. And as I just said, I think we're being trained into more passivity and dependent. And part of that is what you mentioned just a minute ago about sort of spending a lot of time in front of screens and such. It seems like there's a creeping substitution of manufactured experiences for direct experience of the world. And one reason that's troubling is that if human experience is becoming a highly engineered thing, it's also becoming a more manipulable thing. And so kind of have this specter of us kind of living in a world that's been constructed to entertain us and render us kind of helpless with regard to the actual making of that world.
There is a scholar, David Noble, who wrote a book about 30 years ago called America by Design. And he went into the history of the Industrial Revolution and how they started processing independent machinists and others into what was called wage slavery in those days. That is, you became an employee among hundreds of a factory. I grew up in a New England town where we had a bank called Mechanics Savings Bank. And I once asked my dad, where did they get that name from? He said, well, that goes back to the middle 19th century when independent tradesmen, mechanics, plumbers, carpenters, they would contract their work with these rising industrial factories. They would not go to work for them. They were very proud. And when the pressures undermined them and they had to be folded into the employment roles of these textile companies and other manufacturing companies, they lost a lot of their independence, and they became, in today's parlance, more depressed and felt that they were swimming on a stream of absentee ownership that determined their lives. In one of your articles that was brought to my memory because you said that, I'll read it, you said that there's a lot of talk about labor and unemployment and lack of gratification, but very little on the nature of the job itself. That's your words. Could you explain that?
Well, just what is the experience, from hour to hour of actually doing the work that one does? So, I mean, obviously a paycheck is an important, that's largely why we work, is to get paid. But once you've answered the question of how much you're getting paid, you haven't said very much about the character. But to get to what you were just saying about this kind of transition to the assembly line, really, is what we're talking about.
Yes.
The turn of the 20th century or shortly thereafter, where if you compare, the first automobiles were made in carriage works. So these were craftsmen who had a sort of complete handle on what they were doing, and the full scope of the job was within their own view, and they were solving problems every day. The whole point of the assembly line was to replace skilled work with unskilled work. So now all the mentally challenging part of the job is located somewhere else. It's done by those who are designing the assembly line, but those who actually carry out the work, that you don't have to know anything to do that. So, of course, if you can dumb down the job in that way, then you don't have to pay people as much. And so when the assembly line was first introduced by Henry Ford, workers just walked out en masse. I mean, the attrition rate was something like 90%. So, in other words, the contrast to the way they had been working was so great that it kind of led to disgust, really. But at some point, we became accommodated to it. That is, this separation of thinking from doing. And that's part of what has given us these sort of two separate categories of knowledge work versus manual work. But the nice thing about, say, working as a mechanic or plumber or an electrician is that those jobs resist that separation of thinking from doing. It's very different from being on an assembly line. For one thing, the physical circumstances in which you do these jobs varies too much for it to ever get reduced to simply following a set of procedures or a recipe. You constantly have to improvise and solve problems. And that's why those people get paid well, because they are using their mind.
There was a passage in one of your articles, Matthew Crawford. We're speaking with Matthew Crawford. One of his early books was called Shop Classes, Soulcraft, An Inquiry into the Value of Work. There's a motorcycle on the cover, and it made a big splash. It was very favorably reviewed all over the country, including the New York Times. And here's one reason why. I want to quote. He repairs old motorcycles, venerable motorcycles. And here's how he described it. Quote, seeing a motorcycle about to leave my shop under its own power, several days after arriving in the back of a pickup truck, I don't feel tired, even though I've been standing on a concrete floor all day. Peering into the portal of his helmet, I think I can make out the edges of a grin on the face of a guy who hadn't ridden his bike for a while. I give him a wave. With one of his hands on the throttle and the other on the clutch, I know he can't wave back, but I can hear his salute in the exuberant of a crisp throttle gratuitously revved. That sound pleases me, as I know it does him. It's a ventriloquist conversation in one mechanical voice, and the gist of it is, yeah. Now, what kind of response did you get to this book? Did you get a response, by the way, from tradespeople, not just from...
a lot.
You did?
Yeah, a lot of people in the trades writing to me very enthusiastically saying that I managed to kind of express stuff that they experience all the time, but that doesn't get any official recognition from the larger culture. So I was very gratified to kind of feel like I had captured some experience and brought it to wider attention that way. And really the point of that is to try to speak up for the skilled trades and make a case for them as a life that can be worth choosing. You know, they're not for everybody, but if you're someone who wants to use your mind at work and have a certain independence, then they're worth looking into. I think parents often don't want their kids to go down that road. There's this pervasive anxiety that there's only one route to a secure living, and then it passes through a series of gates controlled by prestigious institutions, namely universities. But as you pointed out at the outset, that's become a far less guaranteed outcome than it once was. The college degree has kind of become like the high school degree once was. It's by no means by itself a guarantee to a solid living.
Sorry.
Excuse me, I wanted to ask Matthew, basically if I understand what you're saying is there's the phrase being able to work with your hands, but you're arguing that it's not just that, it's also working with your mind, and it's a type of thinking that we don't necessarily get in what you call the knowledge economy. Is that correct?
Sure. So, for example, I would never, recommend to a young person that they go into doing something like drywall or even framing, because those are jobs that you can't reliably make a living. That's actually a whole other story we could get into. But you have to look sort of more specifically at the trades where you can reliably make a living, and typically those are the ones that are the most mentally demanding. So, yeah.
Before I ask the next question, give our listeners the categories of trades that you're thinking of besides plumbing, carpentry, electrician.
Well, one dimension of this is that jobs that require some license to practice does create a barrier to entry that can have, a positive effect on your wages. And actually, immigration is part of this. So the trades I mentioned of drywall and roofing and framing require no license, and those trades are almost completely dominated by recent immigrants. And part of what happens is that drives wages down. So I think having to acquire a license and get some, pass some written test does provide some kind of disincentive, right, for if your command of the language isn't good. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the picture here. And then also, the stakes are higher with things like electrical and plumbing. If things go badly, if you get it wrong enough, the house can burn down if you're an electrician. So people are willing to pay more for the knowledge that it's done.
I think you put your finger on this. When the tradespeople screw up, it's quite apparent to the customer, the homeowner, the business person. And they're really held accountable. And it's not like they're operating 6,000 miles away in a white-collar job and there's a computer glitch and something really bad and costly happens. And they can say, it's a computer error. It's a computer glitch. It's a virus. And there's no direct connection. And I know I watch tradespeople when they finish a job and it's really done beautifully, like a roofing job or a painting job in a home. They sort of stand back before they leave, and they almost get an aesthetic pleasure out of it.
Sure.
Now, you look at millions of people sitting in front of computers as we speak. What kind of pleasure do they get other than, sneaking in a video game here and there? They don't know the connection between what they're doing. The feedback doesn't give them gratification. You point that out in your book. Can you elaborate on that contrast?
Well, I do hear from people who program who say that coding gives them a certain pleasure, but they also tend to say that they don't get that pleasure at work because they're working on some tiny piece of a vast piece of software, and so they never kind of get the whole picture in mind at once. And so a lot of those people, they end up, writing little elegant programs for themselves in their spare time just to get back some of that pleasure that initially led them into an interest in computers. But when you're fabricating material stuff, you can actually see it there in the world, and it's like your own thought has been manifest in the world and is there for everyone to see. And for that reason, it has a kind of solidity to it, and it's incontestable. And it also means that you have some solid ground to stand on in your self-assessment, right? You're not dependent on the opinion of others because you can just point and say, look, there it is. So you're not having to kind of manage what others think of you.
You see the status of tradespeople going up in recent years, maybe in part to your book, but do you sense that there's a turnaround here and that people don't look down on people who work with their hands, manual labor?
I hope so. I mean, I'm encouraged that some of these arguments have kind of penetrated the culture a little bit. And I think people are starting to rethink these things, in part because of the economy and the realization that there are welders making six figures. So the economic argument for everyone going to university is not nearly as strong as a lot of people thought it was.
Let me put something before you, probably no one has ever done before. I had a talk years ago with Consumer Reports. They get feedback from their consumers about their experience with cars, appliances, stereo sets, and they sort of tabulate them, and it helps them in their ratings for the magazine Consumer Reports, which has 5 million subscribers. It's a big deal for a lot of people in learning how to shop, what to buy and not to buy. And I said to them, why don't you get a representative sample of tradespeople who actually know from experience which furnaces are better than others, which housing materials are better, which tools are better that people buy. They never actually got around to it. I think if they had like 1,000 of these tradespeople around the country, because I've talked to them about this, they really know their business. They know what's a lemon and what isn't a lemon, so to speak. What do you think of that?
I think it's a great idea. I mean, I'm constantly frustrated by buying some, sort of consumer-oriented tool, and it quickly becomes clear that whoever approved this design has never themselves used the tool, and that, as part of what we were talking about, the separation of thinking from doing. There's a separate management class that's often making these decisions. So, I mean, just on the grounds of getting it right, it seems you really have to talk to people who are using things on a daily basis, because as you said, they know what works and what doesn't.
Let's talk a bit about design. What we're seeing here, just, observers at the grassroots, so to speak, is that fewer and fewer things that people buy can be fixed by people themselves, like cars. I mean, it's so hard now to fix a car because everything comes in as a module, it comes in automated, it's computerized. Cars have been called computers on wheels. So I talked to a smart mechanic who went to the GM technical school in the 50s, and he fixed cars for years and years, and he's out of the business now. He just said it's not only impossible, it doesn't even gratify him anymore. Talk a little bit about the design of products, Matthew Crawford.
Well, the current issue for independent mechanics is that the diagnostic software you need to, the cars have these sort of onboard diagnostics where they can self-report what's going on with them. But the software you need to retrieve those trouble codes, the manufacturers are now trying to protect that under copyright law as intellectual property, which would be devastating for independent mechanics. It's already the case that to get access to those codes, you have to pay a lot of money usually to your Snap-on dealer. The Snap-on is the tool vendor that goes around to shops. You've seen their trucks everywhere, I'm sure. So you have to pay for, frequent updates to the software. It's basically a way of kind of rent-seeking by the manufacturers of the cars and by Snap-on as well, just paying for the information that you need to properly diagnose them. So that's a real change from past decades.
And that's only going to get worse as the noose of the intellectual property rights lobby tighten. They're doing the same thing with seeds. Monsanto and others are cornering the seed market, and they're telling farmers in India who used to pass seeds around for centuries between different neighbors and farmers that they got to sign an agreement and buy the seeds, and every year they have to buy new seeds. So that's all part of it. Let me ask you something personally. You have a little motorcycle shop in Richmond, Virginia, and you also are a fellow.
It's actually shifted. I'm no longer repairing bikes. What I'm doing is fabricating parts for custom motorcycles. So the business is
I see. Are you still a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, something very funny struck me. You were describing a very experienced and venerable expert on Honda motorcycle repair that taught you a lot about that motorcycle, and you called him a scholar. You said, what a scholar.
Fred Cousins. Mm-hmm.
Tell me why.
Well, this is when I first started working on motorcycles. I had this problem with a starter motor that just had me completely stumped. Every rule in the book said that it ought to work, but it didn't. Took it around to various Honda dealerships, and no one had an answer. And then someone said, you should talk to Fred. And I took it to him, and, within 10 minutes he'd figured it out. So, calling him a scholar, so that's in the book where I'm talking about there's this very old distinction. In fact, one of the first uses of the word liberal in English is to distinguish the liberal arts from the servile arts. So the liberal arts are, things like mathematics and theology and languages, all what we still call liberal arts. And the servile arts were the mechanical and manual things. So the point of telling Fred's story was that, working at a white-collar job, as I was at the time, I felt more like a slave. And Fred seemed like this sort of scholar of motorcycles, and I was the one who felt servile, and I envied him his life as a independent tradesperson. So that was just a kind of historical reflection of how these concepts of liberal and servile can get reversed in different historical circumstances.
And that's one reason why so many readers of your book, Shop Class's Soulcraft, are so fascinated by it. It's just that kind of depth and contrast. It's sort of opening up new vistas that have been closed by our automated assembly line, industrial, computerized age. Let me ask you, give us some ideas of what's happening on shop class, because, shop class, when I went to high school, there were shop class, and then they started closing them down and putting the computers in their place. Describe to our listeners who don't even know what shop class may be, what it is, and is it coming back, and why do you think it should if it isn't?
Well, I think most Americans over a certain age anyway know what shop class was, is where you went and you learned maybe a little bit of machine shop, maybe a little bit of woodworking, maybe a little bit of electrical work, and certainly automotive. There was auto shop.
In high school?
Yeah.
In high school.
Yeah, in high school, right, in public high schools. And so in the 90s, a lot of shop classes got shut down, and it was a number of reasons. Partly liability, I'm sure, partly cost, but there was also this cultural sense. The internet was kind of just on the horizon. The personal computer was a recent thing, and I think people had this sense that somehow we're going to be gliding around in a pure information economy, and no one will ever have to touch anything again. So the picture is more mixed now. There has been revival of shop classes in some states. It seems to go from sort of state by state. It's also the case that community colleges are sort of picking up the slack. People don't learn this stuff in high school, but then often go to community college or for-profit technical schools. And anecdotally, at least, it seems to be the case. I've talked to a number of people in that world who say that the fastest growing category of students at community colleges is people who already have a 4-year degree, but then go back to community college to get some trade skills that they can actually use to make a living. So I think before we end the conversation, I wanted to bring up one point that I think is really important.
Sure.
That is the role of skilled work in training our attention, because I think we're living through a kind of crisis of attention right now in the culture. Right? We're all complaining about how fragmented our mental lives are, and usually this in the context of some complaint about technology, this sense that you're not really sort of master of your own attention, that you can't direct it where you will, but it gets sort of captured in various ways. I do think that when you go deep into some particular skill or art, that it trains your powers of concentration and perception. And for that reason alone, I think becoming competent in some hands-on skill is an important mental practice that's maybe more important now than ever as a way of combating this sense of mental fragmentation.
Or the attention deficit disorder that they're overdiagnosing with kids. What you just said sparked a recollection of mine. A few years ago, there was a leak in a building where I was in, and we got a plumber, and he spent about an hour trying to find out what was going on. And then he stepped back, and he put his finger on his cheek, and he just thought for about 15 minutes. And I said, Ernie, what are you doing here? I mean, you're charging by the hour. He said, I'm trying to figure it out. See, this is a beautiful book, listeners. It's called Shop Class as Soulcraft. I read the whole book in one sitting, Matthew Crawford. It was 220 pages or so. We didn't do justice to the philosophical richness of this book. He has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago, and one PhD in philosophy who put their hands on making philosophy more concrete and operational in increasing a person's perceptiveness and decreasing a person's, shall we say, arrogance toward people who work with their hands, making the country run every day in every community and not getting sufficient attention. I hope that some listeners, if they have a long-time reliable plumber, electrician, carpenter, you want to give them a gift around holiday time, give them a copy of this book, Shop Class as Soulcraft, an inquiry into the value of work by Matthew B. Crawford. Mr. Crawford, how would the listeners get in touch to you? Do you have a website? Sure, you like good feedback because this book is all about provoking, thoughtful feedback.
Yeah, I think it's MatthewBCrawford.com, without a period after the B. I don't go there too often myself, but I think that's it.
That's what it is. I looked it up.
And I have a new book out that your listeners might enjoy as well, and it's more specifically on this problem of attention as a cultural problem. And that book is entitled The World Beyond Your Head, on Becoming an Individual in an Age of Distraction.
Thank you, Matthew Crawford. Again, the author of The Gripping, and I say that because it gripped me all right. Shop class as soulcraft. You look at your neighborhood differently. You look at the people who service your home differently. It opens up something we should have had opened up in school, in high school, and elsewhere, recognizing what really makes the country go around day after day that will never be outsourced 6,000 miles away. Thank you very much, Matthew Crawford.
Thanks, Ralph, for having me.
We've been speaking with Matthew Crawford, author of Shop Class as Soulcraft, an inquiry into the value of work. Go to MatthewBCrawford.com to find links to that book and to Mr. Crawford's other writings. We're going to take a short break and check in with the corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. Russell?
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Monday, September 21, 2015. I'm Russell Mokhiber. More than 150 people are dead from accidents caused by GM's defective engine switch. GM admitted that it knew as early as 2004 that many of its vehicles contained defective ignition switches and that the company concluded by 2012 that the defective switches could cause airbags to fail. Yet GM did not recall the vehicles. Last week, GM was charged with crimes but was given a deferred prosecution agreement and paid $900 million. GM did not plead guilty. No executives were charged. Ralph Nader called GM a homicidal fugitive from justice. GM's deferred prosecution is a dirty deal, as are almost all the DPAs with major corporate criminals over the last decade. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Ralph, Russell was talking about the recent deferred prosecution agreement between the government and your perennial nemesis, General Motors, which Russell pointed out you called in a recent press release a homicidal fugitive from justice. That's pretty strong words for an old friend.
Not really. These corporations, because they're abstract in terms of the decision made and far away their victims die, are never treated like street criminals when these companies and their executives engage in an intentional cover-up of dangerous vehicles they've sold people year after year, and they don't have them recalled to be fixed, and people die. And that's 174 people died so far, is known, from the GM ignition switch defect, and that's what was the subject of my comment about General Motors. The Justice Department is up to its old concessionary tricks again with corporate criminals. They have delayed prosecution agreements, which means that the companies don't have to plead guilty. They don't have to be known as people who engage in criminal activity, and they get 3 years on good behavior, and the government drops the charges. And in the meantime, the government has a monitor, an individual to monitor the company for good behavior, and the company is fined a modest $900 million, which is really nothing for General Motors. And by the way, what most people don't know, Steve, is that General Motors, when it was bailed out by the U.S. government, stashed away billions of dollars in their treasury. So they're probably paying that fine with taxpayer money. And I made that claim, and it was never denied. So we have to get tough on corporate crime, make the candidates answer the question, what is your policy on corporate crime enforcement? There's a corporate crime wave in the country. The mainstream press is reporting it daily, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, AP, Washington Post. It's on 60 Minutes very often. What is your policy, candidate for president, candidate for Senate, candidate for the House, on cracking down on corporate crime? Are you going to expand the corporate criminal prosecution budgets? Are you going to ask for an upgrade to toughen the corporate criminal statutes, which are weak and obsolete? It's amazing what people just don't think of doing, even though they're ripped off as homeowners, they're ripped off as patients, they're injured in the hundreds of thousands by defective products and toxic environments. We have to do our homework, apply our common sense, and start shaping these political campaigns and not be turned into passive spectators before circus-type debates that we've seen in the Republican presidential nomination arena recently.
Ralph, what has to happen? Because I'm sure the U.S. Attorney, Preet Bharara, and Attorney General Loretta Lynch, they'll tell you that it's so hard to pin something on an individual because they're insulated by so many layers of bureaucracy. Does something have to happen with the law in order for them to have the ability to actually win a case like this?
They have the tools now, as Professor Rena Steinzor of University of Maryland pointed out recently. The same Justice Department prosecuted two small companies. One was a peanut company that sold over time peanuts that were contaminated with salmonella, and 9 people died and many more were injured. They nailed that company. They, in effect, prosecuted the head of the company who had to quit, and they just sentenced him to 28 years in jail. When it came to General Motors, no one was prosecuted. The company was let off from criminal prosecution. No individual was prosecuted. The Justice Department seems to have a new doctrine. It's called corporate crimes without criminals. So the answer to the question is, when they're going after a big, giant corporation, they get cold feet and they basically cave. If it's a small corporation, they'll go after them. And that's a double standard of justice that we have to cease tolerating. Anyway, we do have to make it a big issue in the coming presidential campaign. And I think Bernie Sanders will make it an issue. Elizabeth Warren already makes it an issue. And Hillary Clinton seems to be mimicking some of Bernie Sanders' statements with her rhetoric, so maybe she'll make it an issue.
Well, we're going to switch gears here for a moment. We've been talking a lot recently about the condition of our food supply on the show. Last week, we spoke with Andrew Kimbrell, the director of the Center for Food Safety, and he gave one of the most compelling and cogent arguments against GMOs I have ever heard. He talked about how we spend nearly a quarter of our acreage on producing corn and soy, and how only about 3% of that actually goes toward feeding people. If you haven't heard that, go to ralphnaderradiohour.com and check it out. Also in recent weeks, we spoke with Richard Oswald, president of the Missouri Farmers Union, who spoke to us about the fight for our right to know what country our food is coming from, the whole country of origin labeling issue. And today, we continue our discussion about food with our next guest, Mr. Gary Ruskin, who is the co-founder and co-director of a nonprofit called the U.S. Right to Know, which researches and exposes the failures of the corporate food system. For 9 years, Mr. Ruskin was the executive director and co-founder with Ralph, our very own Ralph, of Commercial Alert, which opposed the, quote, commercialization of every nook and cranny of our lives and culture, unquote. And in 2012, Mr. Ruskin was the campaign manager for California Right to Know. We Californians knew it as Prop 37, which was a statewide ballot measure demanding the labeling of genetically modified foods. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Gary Ruskin.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, welcome, Gary. I often talk about the need for citizen groups to be creative in their strategies, not just do the same thing over and over again and not break through. And Gary Ruskin is a very creative citizen advocate. And here's what he's done recently. He filed Freedom of Information Acts to find out which professors and other scientists at public universities are moonlighting for the likes of Monsanto and the big agribusiness and food processing companies. And to quote from one of Gary's articles, he says, the agrochemical and food industries are spending vast sums of money to convince the public that their food, crops, GMOs, additives, and pesticides are safe, desirable, and healthy. And since the companies themselves are not credible messengers, they use these scientists and professors as sock puppets to shape the media narrative on food issues, particularly GMOs. So, Gary, tell our listeners what you got with the use of the Freedom of Information Act, one of our great victories in 1974 when we got it through Congress.
Well, we found a lot of things, Ralph. First of all, it's important to do new things. And so we thought we'd try this new tactic of trying to understand actually how the food and agrochemical industry works with PR firms and corporate front groups and works with professors who front for all of it. And so the Freedom of Information Act requests have found a wide variety of activities so far that the professors do on behalf of the food industry front groups and the chemical industry front groups like Monsanto. A lot of collusion as far as doing PR work and lobbying work. And there are a million funny stories that have been written up, little nuggets about how they work together. And we were fortunate enough to get a great piece in the New York Times 2 weeks ago by two-time Pulitzer Prize winner Eric Lipton, who went through in great detail all of the ways that because the food and agrochemical industry have found through polling that quote-unquote so-called credible independent third-party scientists are their most potent messenger, how that they can prop up these professors to say that our food is safe and healthy and not to worry about it and try to bury the concerns of consumer advocates like us who have questions about it.
Gary, one thing our listeners may not know is that public universities like Ohio State, Florida State, UCLA, come under the state freedom of information laws. And that's what you used. And you filed demands from 43 public university faculty and staff to learn more about their PR efforts, often moonlighting and out of sight for these companies. These companies, are like brand names. They're Kellogg's, Hershey's, Kraft, Cargill, DuPont, Dow, Syngenta, of course, the notorious Monsanto, ConAgra. And you got 9 responses. And I think that was the basis for the famous New York Times article 2 weeks ago. But one thing about U.S. Right to Know, which is Gary's group, is that he names names. So tell our listeners something about this University of Florida professor, Kevin Folta. That's Folta.
Yeah, so we found a lot of things about Kevin Folta. We found that there was a PR firm, a notorious PR firm called Ketchum, who wrote drafts of texts for Professor Folta for use on the pro-GMO PR website, GMO Answers. We found that essentially a Monsanto executive named Eric Sachs emailed a bunch of professors with essentially commanding them to prepare policy briefs on GMOs. And a number of professors, including Folta, actually did it.
Because they were paying them, right?
We don't actually know exactly why they do it, but that's a good bet. It's been fascinating to see the email exchanges between in the University of Florida. For example, there's a University of Florida professor who discusses how the University of Florida's stance on GMOs and, quoting the word stance there. So we now are in a place where, public universities take stances on commercial products. And that's a very strange thing. Talk about the commercialization of the university. That's an amazing thing. And maybe this is not so surprising given the vast amounts of money that the agrochemical industry and the food industry gives to the University of Florida. For example, Syngenta in 2013 to 2014, Syngenta gave more than $10 million to the University of Florida Foundation. Monsanto more than $1 million. Same with Dow, same with BASF, same with Bayer. And then, lots of other major donors from the food industry. And so who pays the piper calls the tune. And that's a sad thing regarding the University of Florida.
We're talking with Gary Ruskin of U.S. Right to Know. For the few of our listeners who may not know what GMO stands for, it's genetically modified organisms. And it's basically genetically modified seeds that are grown to produce food in the supermarket that is genetically modified but not labeled as such, because Monsanto and other lobbyists have kept blocking any state or federal effort to let you know that when you go into the supermarket what's genetically modified and what isn't, although there's some breakthroughs here at the state level, which we can talk about. But let's get back to Professor Folta. In one of your statements, you say the following. This is because Professor Folta denied that he had any formal connection to Monsanto and that he was not basically a promoter. of Monsanto's version of corporate science. And I'm going to quote from your statement. Quote, "At best, these statements by Professor Folta are misleading. Some of them are untruthful. Yet, as the emails released today reveal, Folta has been in close touch with Monsanto, and the industry's PR firm, Ketchum, recently received a $25,000 unrestricted grant from Monsanto, and even wrote to a Monsanto executive, quote, 'I'm glad to sign on to whatever you like or write whatever you like,' end quote." Is that Folta talking or the PR firm Ketchum?
No, that's actually a direct quote from Kevin Folta. "I'm glad to sign on to whatever you like or write whatever you like." It's an email that he writes to someone named Lisa Drake, who is the head of state and local government relations for Monsanto. And I think, one of the things that's so amazing here when you look at the documents is the utter servility of some of these professors to Monsanto and to the agrochemical industry. And it's shocking to see public university professors whom we pay for with our tax dollars acting so servilely to large corporations and in promoting their products when those products may not be in our best interest to consume.
Let me ask a more technical question. At Harvard Law School, the law professors are required to file on a website all their moonlighting business. So if, for example, a law professor is moonlighting for a large corporation on an antitrust issue or for a drug company on an intellectual property issue, that has to be filed. And, of course, Harvard is a private university, so you couldn't FOIA Harvard. But what was the format at these public universities that you filed the Freedom of Information request? Did they actually have this ready so the student newspaper, for example, could have gotten it at any time? Or did they have to gather it together specially to respond to your request?
Well, we FOIA'd emails and documents, so the universities have had to assemble the requests, individually because this was not centralized. It was difficult to piece some of it together just because of the deceptiveness, the trickery of people like Kevin Folta. Like, for example, he repeatedly denied any ties to Monsanto. And then he also deliberately, when we found the account, when we found out that actually Monsanto had given him a $25,000 grant, they deliberately put it in an account which was not disclosed for conflict of interest purposes and is essentially a hidden slush fund. And so they've made it very hard for us to follow the money, and we're looking for other reporters who want to help us track the money.
Well, just to be clear, they don't have a ready database the way Harvard Law School does. Because Harvard Law School, let's say Harvard Law School was a public university and they received a Freedom of Information request from Gary Ruskin of U.S. Right to Know, they would basically say, here it is. It's all orderly. It's all written by professor, by corporate client. They don't have how much the professor is made by these moonlighting efforts, but at least they have the connection. And I take it the public universities you filed a FOIA with don't have that kind of neat, ready to disclose database. Is that correct?
That's correct. Just to give you an example, so a lot of the activity on behalf of the academic activity on behalf of the biotech industry happens at the University of California, Davis. And so we had to specifically, make a request to UC Davis for agrochemical industry funding. And actually, they're charging us $500 just to obtain the records regarding agrochemical industry funding of UC Davis.
Did the other universities charge you too?
Some have charged us and some have not. Yes.
Usually you can get a waiver if you're a public interest group, nonprofit, and you're just relaying it to the public, and it's right to know.
It's true, but the universities and the industries are very deeply worried about these FOIAs. And in fact, Monsanto and its allies launched quite a counterattack against them, a PR counterattack. And so, everyone is dragging their feet as much as they can to try to make sure that no more documents come out.
Let me ask you an extensive question. Did you take this information and give it to the college newspapers like at Florida and Davis so they can write it up in the college newspapers, which, of course, is closer to home? A lot of these universities, they don't really care what some paper, even a big one like the New York Times, says long way, but they're really sensitive to the local paper, the local town or city paper as well as the college papers. Have you done that yet?
I just sent a note to the Harvard Crimson today because there's a Harvard aspect to this stuff as well. We're working with many reporters on these documents right now, and we certainly hope to be working with university press.
Gary Ruskin, spell it out right down to the dinner table. What happens when these big companies, who aren't very credible, because people say, well, they have an axe to grind, they hire these professors who are scientists and other specialists to front for them, to give them plausibility and credibility. What's the damage to the food that ends up on your dinner table?
What happens is essentially these professors end up speaking PR bullet points on behalf of the agrochemical and food industries and their PR firms. And so what you hear is what the industry and its PR firms want them to say, as opposed to what is actually true. And so it's a form of corporate welfare, to be sure, but in addition, it's a form of deception, and a pernicious one, because these are public institutions. These are our public bodies. These are our public universities, and they ought to tell us the truth about our food.
In other words, on the dinner table, people are getting food that should be regulated, it should be controlled, should be labeled. Why should a listener who's a consumer worry about this personally?
Because we all, food is love. We all want to feed our kids and our family the best, healthiest food we can feed them. If we're not getting told the truth about what's in our food, that's a serious problem, because there may be serious problems with GMOs or additives or artificial sweeteners. Pesticides. We need to know more about these things, and marketing of junk food to kids as well. We need to know more about them, and we need honest voices within academia to tell us the problems within our food system, and not just to make PR points on behalf of large multinational corporations.
In the concluding moments, tell us a little bit about your past work on commercial alert and the commercialization of our culture and the damage.
Well, Ralph, you and I, we started Commercial Alert in the late 1990s to oppose the commercialization of every nook and cranny of our lives and culture. And part of that work was to oppose the marketing of junk food to children. And we had, we launched the movement to kick junk food out of schools, built the first national coalition to do that. And it's been so heartening to see so many people take up that battle by the thousands across the country. And so we did lots of good things together, and I'm proud of them.
Not only that, but the whole obesity epidemic among young children, leading to high blood pressure, diabetes, a whole set of life-shortening ailments, comes from this, to a significant degree, from the deliberate marketing, bypassing, undermining parental authority to children as young as 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. Junk food and junk drink, that's damaging to them. And this is the point that Gary Ruskin has made again and again, that when safety values are subordinated to commercial profit values, people suffer, children suffer. Tell us a little bit about the new group you have, US Right to Know, and give the website how people can get in touch with you.
So it's US Right to Know, usrtk.org is the website. And we're trying to expose what the food industry doesn't want us to know about our food. We're trying to break real hard news about what's in your food and why you should care and what you can do about it. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're new. We're just 7 months old or so. So please check it out, and we hope you'll like it.
And do you invite membership of any kind or contributions?
We invite contributions. We don't have membership yet. We're new and we're just starting, and we just have 1.25 staff, 1.5 staff. So maybe sometime in the future, but we just got to get going first.
Another example of how very few people can make a big difference.
Gary, I have one last question. We can wrap up with this. I'm in California, and I remember the whole Prop 37 GMO labeling fight, and that proposition lost. And my question is, what are the industry's arguments against labeling that are so good that they convince ordinary people to vote against it?
Well, so I was the campaign manager of Prop 37. And so the industry never actually defends GMOs, nor does it ever make direct arguments against GMO labeling. They follow the industry playbook for defeating these sorts of initiatives, whether it's insurance or, regarding food or lots of other things. So they always say that it's poorly written and that it benefits special interests. Like lawyers is a common one. That's the kind of argument that they make, and they often...
And it's going to raise your prices.
Raise prices at the dinner table, even though, none of those things things are true. They have this playbook that they can use, that they use on all of these initiatives, and it works. Prop 37, we spent $8.4 million, and the opposition spent $46 million. So we were totally, we were very much outspent. And, increasingly elections are more like sales and less like elections. And that's the sad truth in America.
But you came close, and it came close in Oregon, and Connecticut and Vermont are moving legislatively. I think the tide's going to turn, and I think Monsanto senses that.
I think so, too. I mean, I do think that we will win totally sometime in the next couple of years, just because the industry cannot keep fighting these highly visible battles where they are so tightly tied to such negative campaigning and so many lies during the campaign. It looks very bad for them, and it's just not a sustainable strategy. The customer is always right, and, it's pretty clear what the customer wants. The New York Times once did a poll like 2 years ago, said that 93% of Americans want GMO labeling. So they're just not going to be able to hold out against that kind of consumer pressure for long.
Aren't some supermarket chains announcing they're not going to sell genetically modified food?
We're hearing more and more about pressure on chains and increasing efforts to make individual chains label in their own stores. And so, it's very clear what the people want. The people just want to know what's in their food. So it'll happen. And this is a right that 64 other countries have, to the right to know whether your food is made with GMOs. And so we'll get it here in the United States, too.
64 countries require labeling, including what? Russia and China?
Yes. All of Europe. I mean, yeah, it's amazing, but it's true. And so we'll win. I mean, we're too strong here in the United States not to win.
On that positive note, thank you, Gary Ruskin, the director and founder of U.S. Right to Know.
Thank you, Ralph. Nice talking with you.
Okay.
We've been talking with Gary Ruskin, who is the co-founder and co-director of U.S. Right to Know. To reach Gary, go to Gary at usrtk.org. That's usrtk.org. That's our show. I want to thank our guest today, Matthew Crawford, author of Shop Class as Soulcraft. Go to MatthewBCrawford.com. And also thanks to Gary Ruskin, co-founder and co-director of US Right to Know. For more info there, go to usrtk.org. For Ralph's weekly blog, go to nader.org. If you have missed any of this show on the radio, go to ralphnaderradiohour.com or subscribe for free on iTunes or Stitcher. All of our shows are archived there with valuable links to our guests and their work. There is also a link to Ralph's latest book, Return to Sender, Unanswered Letters to the President, 2001 to 2015. Our producers are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. On behalf of David Feldman, my name is Steve Scrovan. Talk to you next week, Ralph.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you, listeners. Again, call up radio stations, have them carry the program, and expand the podcast download. This is a great circle of people, serious people, want to turn the country around. It all starts with a conversation.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long. Thieves in the temple